Well, the title of today's talk is Meat Eating and the Biology of Disgust. And this is actually one of the more interesting talks that I do, and it's one of my favorite talks. And it's the talk that I tell people I can convince you that even though you may eat meat, you really don't like it. Now, I know that doesn't pertain to anybody here, but you'll be able, after seeing this lecture, to go home and convince your friends that even though they're still eating dead, rotting carcasses, they really don't like them. That's what this talk is all about. And so people have often asked me, well, how did you come up with this topic? And it turned out that I was doing some reading in the psychology literature on the phenomenon of disgust. Because disgust, as we will see as we move throughout this lecture, is one of the 6 basic human emotions that we're all born with. And when I looked at the things that all human beings around the world found disgusting, it turned out that they had some things in common, and they were describing essentially animal tissue in its unaltered form. I realized, wow, maybe that's why we have to do all the things that we do to animal flesh to make it palatable to us. But I don't want to give too much away. So without further ado, let's go ahead and proceed. And I like to start all of my lectures off with a quote from the Bible. This is from the book of Revelation. It said, "And the Lord showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, and on either side of the river were the trees of life, which bear 12 manner of fruits, and the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations." And then I found this picture that had a tree that had a bunch of different fruits on it, and I thought that's kind of cute. So, by way of introduction, humans have the palate of an herbivore. We love and crave the taste, textures, colors, and varieties of plant foods. Although people often eat meat, we really don't like it, as you will see. That is why we're compelled to change its form, taste, and texture to make it acceptable and palatable. This lecture explores what our biology and psychology are trying to tell us about who we are as a species and what we should be eating as opposed to what many of us choose to eat. And I just wanted to put this little cartoon in here because this guy is really unclear on the concept of what health is all about. He says, "Why, yes, I'm extremely concerned about the health effects of radiation from Japan. Now pass me my bacon cheeseburger." Which one do you think is going to kill him first? So first we're going to address the question, look at the psychology and neurobiology of disgust. What exactly disgust is, where it's located in our brain. Disgust is a universal human emotion with a characteristic facial expression that is recognized across cultures. The disgust reflex is present in infants and is believed to be one of the 6 basic human emotions. Now, I choose to believe that she's feeding him eggplant, because that's the same face I make when people feed me eggplant. The other 5 emotions are happiness, sadness, fear, anger, and surprise. From a teleological standpoint, all 6 of these emotions mediate appropriate interactions between individuals and the environment and among individuals within the larger social group. So these basic emotions serve to facilitate survival both for individuals and for our larger social group. Disgust is therefore a hardwired neural phenomenon that is an important survival reflex. And I'm just kind of sort of restating that a couple times because I want you guys to understand this is not something we're making up. This is not something we're inventing. This is not something we went to the store and bought. This is something that is in our brain. It is there to help us survive as an individual organism, but both as a species, because it's that important. Disgust improves survival both for the individual and the group by facilitating the rapid acquisition of persistent avoidance behaviors to potentially harmful phenomena. Now, what does that mean in plain English? Well, what that means is that if I am out walking in the field with this gentleman, Kevin, here in the green shirt, and I see him pick up something that looks like a piece of fruit, he bites into it and then immediately spits it out and goes, ugh. I don't have to run over and put that in my mouth, okay? I know that whatever it was is nasty, okay? So I've already learned from simply watching him and looking at his facial expression that whatever it was, is in fact not good to eat. And so even if Kevin, bless his heart, should die later on from having put that in his mouth, I won't, because I didn't put it in my mouth. You won't die. We're there for you.
I'm not getting into that.
MRI studies of our brain have shown that this disgust reflex is located in an area of the brain called the anterior insular cortex, which, as you can see where the arrow is pointing, is right there. And this area of the brain is also important in other stomach-related functions, such as recognizing unpleasant taste, nausea, and stomach sensations such as dyspepsia. Disgust is distinguishable from fear, which is another one of the basic emotions, in that while fear heightens activity in preparation for fight or flight, disgust promotes the suspension of activity. So, for instance, if suddenly there burst through that window a rabid animal, or say John Boehner, or Newt Gingrich, we would all jump up and either be ready to run or ready to fight for our lives. Whereas disgust, on the other hand, makes us want to stop doing whatever it is that we're doing. Disgust exerts strong negative effects on behavior that can be permanent and defy reason. We've all heard of these stories of people who've eaten something that made them sick and they can't stand the sight of it. And I just tell you, think about the last time your toothbrush fell in the toilet. Even if you fished it out, steam cleaned it with bleach, would you ever put it back in your mouth? No, because it's disgusting. Now, you know intellectually that toothbrush has no germs on it, but it is still disgusting because it was in the toilet, for God's sake. But that just tells you how powerful this emotion of disgust is. So the biological origin and purpose of the disgust facial expression and reflex is to cause us to reject and eject potentially harmful items before they cause ill health, and to rapidly transfer that learned avoidance behavior to our larger social group. Now, there are three domains of disgust. Current theories of disgust argue that the emotion of disgust falls into three functional domains. There's pathogen disgust, which is going to be the primary topic of our lecture. Then there's sexual disgust and moral disgust. Again, pathogen disgust, principal subject of this lecture, primarily concerned with protecting the individual and the social group from agents or behaviors that represent a proximal and imminent threat to life, limb, or health, and possibly social order. Sexual disgust concerns itself with the avoidance of unfavorable sexual pairings that could result in unviable offspring. So that would include things like incestuous pairings, having sex with unhealthy individuals or with elderly persons or children, and or with those who are in some way genetically defective. And if you want to think of a good example of this, remember when Hugh Hefner was about to marry that 18-year-old girl, and we all kind of went, that's disgusting. That's sexual disgust. Moral disgust pertains to social transgressions and antisocial behaviors such as lying, stealing, cheating, meanness or cruelty, and violence towards others, and so on. So what are some of the elicitors of disgust? There is, of course, wide personal and cultural variation in what's found to be disgusting, as we've already discussed. Disgust not only encompasses dietary issues, but also has a very strong moral and social component. And for instance, my personal list includes Glenn Beck, Ann Coulter, Rush Limbaugh, John Boehner, Clarence Thomas, Dick Cheney, Donald Trump and his hair, and the TV show Jersey Shore, among other things.
Right on.
Sounds like a lot of those things make your list too. However, studies have shown that there are elicitors of pathogen disgust that are consistent across cultures. In other words, when we look at all cultures around the world, there are certain things that in every culture tend to make the list of what is found to be disgusting. And what are those things? Well, here they are. Qualities of things that are found to be disgusting across cultures are things that are moist, slimy, wet, soft, sticky, things that are greasy or oily, things that are squishy, things that are putrid or foul, things that have asymmetry or are amorphous in shape, things covered with flies, things that are bloody, things that are decaying or rotting, things that have that include animal effluent, or things that are covered with hair or fur, things that are gory, things covered with worms and maggots. And once, when I gave this lecture, a lady said to me, "I don't think hair is disgusting." I said, "Okay, I'll bring you a big bowl of soup with a giant hair in it, and we'll see if you change your mind." All right, so now let's look at how we sense and perceive food, because of course that will determine how we identify things that are disgusting. To understand how we recognize and identify things that are disgusting, we must first understand how our brains see and perceive. By the time you or I become aware of something, their significant preconscious visual processing has already taken place. Before we become consciously aware of anything that we're looking at, our subconscious brain has actually recognized the salient features of that object and automatically routed the appropriate visual information to certain conscious brain recognition centers. And this is illustrated by how we see and perceive faces. Now, by the time each of you became aware of that picture, nobody out here had to say, "Wait a minute, I see an oval structure with two eyes, a nose, and a mouth, and some hair. I'm looking at a face." And then had to figure out, "Oh, I'm looking at Bill Clinton." By the time that picture came up and you became aware of it, you knew you were looking at Bill Clinton. And if you actually did have to go through that process, please see me after this lecture, because you're likely having a stroke. And our ability to recognize faces is so strong that we even recognize this cartoon as Bill Clinton. Our propensity to see faces is so strong that we're able to see faces in line drawings and even in the craters of the moon. And that's again because this information is rooted to areas in our brain that are tasked with the job of actually recognizing faces. Correctly identifying and responding to potentially nutritious food is critically important because an inappropriate disgust response to food will lead to an eating disorder, which leads to starvation and leads to death. In fact, the primary problem in the condition known as anorexia nervosa is that the individuals afflicted with that disorder develop an inappropriate disgust response to all food. And as a result, they simply don't want to eat, and they won't eat. And they will starve themselves to death if aggressive interventions are not implemented. And so it's critically important that we be equipped as living organisms with the ability to recognize food and to respond appropriately to it. So again, it's important that when I came into this room and I saw that lovely food laid out there, that I started eating the food and not the bowls that the food was in. That I recognized that the food was the food and not the table or, the wastebasket or, God forbid, another person. The mechanisms that we use to recognize faces are similar to those that we use to identify food. To avoid evoking a disgust response to potentially nutritious food, our brain uses preconscious visual cues to invoke what I call food interest attention in appropriate items. The brain is able to do this because of the perceptive properties of the human eye and the neural wiring of our visual cortex. So let's look at our eye. The human eye is designed to perceive color and fine detail. We actually perceive detail over 10 times greater than your typical carnivore like a cat or a dog, which helps us recognize and find edible plants and plant parts. Much of this incredible visual processing ability comes from the stupendous computing power of our visual cortex. Now, the important things that I want you to notice about this drawing is that the most acute vision in our eye, the best vision, is located in this area called the phobia, which in cross-section looks like a pit, but it's actually a dimple in the back of the eye. That's where you have the greatest concentration of cone photoreceptors, which allow you to perceive color and fine detail. So we have a phobia in our eye, which is a pit that has these cone photoreceptors. 70% of the neurons in our brain are in some way connected to our visual cortex. We can see a range of more than 10 million hues, and we can rapidly shift from deep to near focus, as well as easily switch from panoramic viewing to looking for fine detail. Now, our visual neural wiring causes us to see and perceive schema when looking for patterns and forms in the detailed information that we pick up with our eyes. This kind of vision is very helpful when looking for food from plant sources because plants tend to package their edible parts in very showy and stereotypical forms such as fruits, seeds, seed pods, leaves, roots, and tubers. And they do this because this is the way they get themselves spread around because, as you know, plants don't have legs. They can't get up and walk around. So how do they get spread? They get spread by having animals come along, eat their seeds, and then walk some distance away and deposit their seeds with a little bit of fertilizer, so hopefully it'll grow. And although mammalian carnivores have binocular vision like us, their eyes are actually constructed very differently from ours, such that they see the world in a very different way than we do. And so we're going to spend just a minute talking about the way carnivores see, because I want you to understand that even though carnivores have binocular vision, they see the world very differently than we do, and their eyes are constructed very differently from ours. Because I was tired of hearing people say, well, we're supposed to be predators because we have binocular vision. Well, that's like saying a hummingbird is supposed to be a raptor because it has wings. The two are not comparable. So how do carnivores see and perceive food? Pattern-oriented color vision would actually be a distinct disadvantage for a carnivore because it is more easily deceived by camouflage. The eyes of carnivores do not have trichromatic color vision because their retinas only have a limited number of one or two type of cone receptors. And I will tell you that when I first started doing, and I'm glad Ted's here because Ted is a radiologist. And when I first started doing my radiology rotations as a medical student and we were looking at CAT scans, I noticed the CAT scans were on a grayscale, a black and white grayscale. And I said, why aren't these things in color? They'd be so much more vivid and more interesting if they were in color. And what the radiologist explained to me was that, number one, you can see a much greater range of difference by using a grayscale. And number two, having differences in color might cause you to see differences, basically perceive differences that really aren't there, and or miss things that might be there. So that for picking up subtle things like tumors and abnormalities in tissues, it's much better to have that grayscale where you can look for subtle differences than having your brain fooled by seeing differences in color. So carnivores don't have color vision.
Does this mean that hunters are fooling themselves?
Yes, they are. right.
Camouflage clothing is only for the benefit of.
Well, what's helpful for the camouflage is the breaking up of the pattern, but the actual colors they could be out there in bright hot pink. It might not matter. Although to some extent the amount of light thrown off by their clothing might be perceived by the animals, but the eyes of carnivores contain mainly monochromatic rod photoreceptors that function best at night, and their eyes have a layer of reflective cells at the back of them called the tapetum lucidum that amplifies low light levels. This is why when you shine a light in your pet's eyes, their eyes shine, because they basically have a mirror at the back of their eye to amplify low light levels. Why is that? Well, it's because most carnivores hunt at night when their prey species are asleep. So they need some way to amplify the low light levels that are available at night so they can see well. And they basically have their own built-in night vision goggles. Now, I don't know how many of you watch TV, but there's this kind of funny Geico cartoon that's going or commercial that's out now where these antelope have night vision goggles, and they sort of see this lion trying to sneak up on them, and they tell him, "Carl, you need to become a vegan because we can see you." and they say, "Well, how happy are you? How happy are Geico customers?" They're happy as antelopes with night vision goggles. Well, carnivores have their own built-in night vision goggles. Instead of a phobia, instead of that pit at the back of the eye, a carnivore's eyes actually have what's called the most accurate vision and acute vision in a carnivore's eyes is located along a strip, a horizontal strip at the back of the eye called a visual streak. So they don't have phobias, they have a visual streak. And this visual streak allows them to easily track movement. And not only do they easily track movement, but whenever something moves across that visual streak, they are stimulated to chase it, which is why if you drag a string or a feather in front of your cat or something in front of your dog, they can't help themselves. They have to run after it because they're hardwired to chase things that are moving. Anything moving across that visual streak, they're stimulated to chase it. And the visual streak enables them to easily track movement, and the tapetum allows them to see well and hunt at night. They see at least 6 times better at night than we do. So if there were ever any human beings that were supposed to be out hunting at night, they got selected against because none of us have a piece of tapetum lucidum in the back of our eyes. Carnivores see the world in a black and white pixel mosaic that is geared towards detecting movement. Well, why is that? Because motion is the visual cue that signals food, interest, attention, and that stimulates food, interest, attention in carnivores. And this is very easy to understand. They're hardwired to chase anything that moves because if something is moving, it can likely be eaten because there are no motors or automatic anything in nature. Anything that's moving in nature typically is alive. And if something is alive, that means it can probably be eaten. Often, carnivores and true carnivores will actually begin feeding on their prey while it's actually still alive and moving. Natural meat eaters are actually stimulated by bloody raw flesh. True predators also willingly eat putrid, rotting flesh. These animals will kill without reservation or remorse, especially if their prey is perceived to be weak, sick, or vulnerable, such as the young, old, or disabled. And attacking the weak, sick, or vulnerable usually provokes moral disgust in humans. Very interesting. Now let's look at how we see and perceive food. Edible plant parts are generally brightly colored, smooth-edged, discretely shaped objects that are small enough to be held in our hand. So in order for an item to be perceived as potential food, it has to be smooth-edged, discretely shaped, symmetrical, and preferably hand-sized and colorful, because these are the characteristics that are the visual cues that signal food or good food to our subconscious brain and will thereby stimulate food interest attention in us. And something that an interesting phenomenon that grows out of this is probably the reason why women paint their lips red. It's likely that the full, rounded, luminously red lips mimic the appeal of ripe fruit and stimulate men to want to kiss and eat the lips.
Amen.
And this is a quote from Yale neurobiologist Dana Small, Scientific American, July 2008, said, although sight plays a less direct role than smell in the perception of flavor, it, referring to sight, is the sense most often used to identify food in humans, and it thereby affects the expectations of the food's attributes. And just looking at some typical edible plant parts, you can see again, they're all brightly colored, smooth-edged, and small enough to be held in our hands. And here are a few more. And in addition to this, to perceive an object as food, it must not only have these aforementioned characteristics, but it must also have the smell, taste, and texture of plants and plant parts. And very importantly, it must not move. Okay? Now just think about it. How would you like to try and eat something that's squirming around on your plate, looking at you and screaming? Most of us would be horrified. But again, carnivores don't mind. So let's look at food choices and disgust. Some typically disgusting pictures, huh? So just to review, we're going to review those elicitors of disgust: moist, slimy, wet, soft, sticky, greasy, oily, foul, squishy, putrid, foul, asymmetric, amorphous in shape, things covered with flies, blood, decaying, rotting, animal effluent, hair, fur, gore, worms, and maggots. Well, first we're going to look at blood, gore, and violence. And we're going to look at something called the blood injury phobia reflex. It's long been recognized that humans have an innate aversion, in essence, a disgust response to the sight of blood dismemberment. Nearly 500 years ago, Shakespeare wrote in one of his plays, "Many will swoon when they do see blood." That's from As You Like It. And if many of us may have had that experience, seeing blood and passing right out. Lightheadedness or fainting at the sight of blood or dismemberment is equally common in both men and women, though some argue that men are actually somewhat more likely to faint at the sight of blood than women.
That's certainly true for their own blood.
And I don't know if you caught that, but it kind of makes sense, because if women were as likely to faint at the sight of blood than we were to pass out once a month. Studies show that this loss of consciousness or lightheadedness is a result of a central nervous system reflex that causes a drop in heart rate and blood pressure that leads to decreased perfusion of our brain. Research has shown that the CNS-mediated decrease in heart rate and blood pressure upon seeing blood, violence, and injury is present from an early age, and so it's believed to be the normal response for human. Well, what scientific data do we have to support that? Well, let's look at something called the flow-mediated dilation. And this is a study called the effect of video viewing on vascular reactivity. The slide was given to me courtesy of Dr. Jeffrey Novick. I think you've had Jeff up here before, have you?
We've shown his video.
Okay.
We haven't been able to
Yeah, if you ever see anything by Jeff, watch it. He's an awesome lecturer. So what happened? Well, they took these volunteers and they had them watch two different movies. They had them watch a comedy, one called Kingpin. Who picked that, I don't know. But it's a comedy starring Woody Harrelson, and they then had them, and they measured their vascular reactivity afterwards. And then they had them watch Saving Private Ryan, which we probably all have seen. And as you all know, opens with one of the bloodiest, most violent, most gory scenes in all of movie history, and then measured their vascular reactivity. Well, what did they find? What they found was that after watching the comedy, when you measured the vascular reactivity, the ability of blood vessels to dilate and increase blood flow, it actually increased an average of 22% in the volunteers after watching the comedy. But when these same volunteers were shown this horrifically violent, bloody movie Saving Private Ryan, their ability to, their blood flow through their blood vessels actually decreased by an average of 35%. Now, there's, of course, a Republican in here who I just don't know what to say about him. But
We're not a political organization, please.
yeah,
Welcome
but yeah. He can say that, but yeah. All right. The reasons for the presence of this reflex in humans have been extensively debated. Some people with limited knowledge have said that, well, maybe we developed this blood injury phobia reflex as a way of warding off predation by playing dead. You know, when something is trying to kill you and eat you, you lay down and play dead and it'll stop, right? Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because a dead, bleeding victim is exactly the result a predator is trying to achieve. So if something is trying to eat you, laying down and pretending to be food is really not going to stop it from trying to eat you. When scentless newborn fawns lie motionless on the savannah or, you know, on the American plains, they're not playing dead. What they're, in fact, doing is trying to mimic an inanimate, inert object. Because as I told you before, carnivores don't see detail well. So if these animals don't move, the carnivore cannot distinguish them from the background. And if they don't have any scent, they can't smell them. And so they go out looking for them, but they can't find them because that fawn that's laying there looks like a rock. And they can't smell it, and they will walk right past it. And that's one of the reasons that one of the first things carnivores do when they start hunting, and certainly the carnivores that hunt in packs, is they try to spook the herd into running so that they can start to distinguish them from the background and pick out which ones to chase. The sight and smell of blood are in fact stimulatory to carnivores and will likely spur them to begin feeding once their prey stop moving. Hence, looking like food will not deter a predator bent on obtaining a meal. If playing dead ever works, it usually only works in instances where an animal is seeking to protect its young from a perceived threat. Someone should have told that to the Anderson brothers. The caption reads, "And no one ever heard from the Anderson brothers again." And again, yes, it will work if a mother animal thinks it, like for instance, a mother bear thinks you're a threat to her cubs, and you suddenly lay down and pretend to be dead. She doesn't perceive you to be a threat anymore. She may walk away and leave you alone. But if you're actively being hunted, your best bet is to fight like crazy because laying down is only going to get you eaten. A more likely reason for the existence of this blood injury phobia reflex in humans is to serve as a brake on interpersonal conflict in a social species, that is us, that does not have instinctual, ritualized behaviors that regulate and limit such conflicts. Now, all social animals have to have some way of relating to one another so that they can limit conflicts. Because you're going to have conflicts if you live together. And most animals can adopt these ritualized postures and gestures that let them know who's kind of the big boss and who has the rights to this patch of land or that patch of land so that they don't end up killing each other. Well, the one really hallmark of being a human being is that we don't have those kind of instinctual behaviors. We have very few limits placed on us by our biology. So we do have to have some mechanism to keep us from killing each other. And many people believe it is this blood-indria phobia reflex. And what is the evidence of that? Well, this comes from an article called Blood Injury Illness Phobia that was published in the Journal of Clinical Psychology by an author, Thayer, and his colleagues. And it says the adaptive significance of an aversion to the sight of blood or mutilation may involve an evolved natural inhibitory influence that serves to prevent the species from unchecked aggression that could lead to self-destruction. So in other words, if we get into a fight and you start bleeding, and I start bleeding, and we both see that blood, we pass out, the fight is over. Okay? And that keeps us from bashing each other's brains in, ordinarily. Unfortunately, research and experience have consistently shown that humans can become inured to the sight of blood, and our aversion to violence and dismemberment can be overcome by conditioning, training, and socialization. This is a quote from an article called Vegetanicity of Violence, Biochemical and Cardiac Responses to Violent Films and Television Programs that appeared in the British Medical Journal by Carruthers. It says, to increase the audience for violence, the vehicle for it is supercharged with the excitement generated by sexual themes and powerful music and given a hard gloss of professionalism, enabling the most sordid events to be presented in a brilliant, glittering, ultraviolet light. So in other words, we take these very violent, otherwise offensive scenes, and we connect them to other things and other qualities that we find desirable. Like we tell people being violent is masculine, and it'll make you sexy, and it means that you are, big and bad, and all the ladies will love you, and all this sort of nonsense, and that makes it easier for us to accept and swallow. And this ability to overcome our innate aversion to blood and violence has good and bad aspects. It has allowed society to train surgeons, nurses, and paramedics. Tragically, however, it has also allowed us to create soldiers, weapons, and the atrocity of war. To make war palatable, we use evocative words to convince ourselves that it's about virility, honor, glory, valor, which I think is one of the most empty words in the English language, and in the latest incarnations, democracy. Sadly, however, these are words which resonate only in the ears of the living. We always seem so naively surprised when war, in fact, proves to be hellish, brutal, cruel, ugly, and often pointless. Again and again, we find that the pretty words we use are simply the lies we tell ourselves. We tell our youth to entice them into dying and ourselves so that we will willingly let them go off to die. The bottom line is that humankind's distaste for bloodletting, and violence is probably why we have created specific professional classes such as soldiers, butchers, and executioners to perform the tasks that we personally find repellent, but then we leave them to deal with the post-traumatic stress disorder and other negative psychological fallout that stem from violating our intrinsic nature. And interestingly, in this current situation, 20% of Army troops and 42% of National Guard troops return from combat with new mental illness diagnoses. Suicides in deployed National Guard troops are up a whopping 82% from 2009 and 450% from 2004. Army suicides doubled between 2001 and 2006. And one of the reasons that people suspect that the suicides are greater in the National Guard troops as opposed to the Army troops is the fact that the National Guard troops tend to return to civilian life more quickly than the Army, whereas the individuals in the Army have their comrades to kind of help see them through. The National Guard troops don't have that kind of camaraderie to help support them. Did you have a question, sir?
What happens with slaughterhouse workers?
The question is, what happens with slaughterhouse workers? And that's a very interesting question because there is some evidence that slaughterhouse workers can also experience some of the psychological trauma as well. But again, over time, because they convince themselves, I have to do this to support my family, to make a living, they sort of force themselves to go through it. But there is some a negative psychological fallout that results from it, to say nothing. And there's very high turnover, yes, absolutely. The bottom line is that a blood injury violence phobia reflex could not exist in a true predator species. It would clearly be maladaptive for a predator to pass out or become nauseous at the point at which it began to kill its prey. Wouldn't eat very often. So the human aversion to blood violence and dismemberment shows that we are not natural predators. Human anatomy, physiology, disease susceptibilities, and psychology unequivocally demonstrate that we are natural herbivores. While blood and gore elicit a strong disgust response in us, no one has ever passed out from watching someone eat an apple, with the possible exception of Adam. And this is a New Yorker cartoon. He says, "Miss, oh miss, for God's sakes, please stop." All right, let's look at moist, wet, and slimy. Animal flesh in its unaltered form has many, if not most, of the characteristics all human beings find disgusting. If you were to offer a ragged, squishy, wet, slimy, bloody piece of raw flesh to most humans, they simply wouldn't eat it, but carnivores, of course, absolutely love it. If people attempted to eat unpreserved, unbutchered, raw flesh without cutlery, many would choke to death or die from food poisoning or parasitic infections. This is particularly true if the flesh is starting to rot and is covered with disease-causing organisms like flies, beetles, maggots, and pathogenic bacteria. The smell of rotting flesh is perceived by humans as a malodorous stench, and it induces a nausea and retching, vomiting reflex in us that will cause us to throw up whatever it is that we have eaten in an attempt to rid our bodies of potentially dangerous or harmful material. This is the brain's way of saying, don't even think of trying to eat this stuff. Our innate aversion to raw and putrid animal flesh is a survival mechanism meant to protect us from ingesting things we're not designed to eat and that could kill us by causing us to choke to death or die from infectious agents. Now, carnivores, by contrast, are actually drawn to decaying flesh and will dine on it for several days with absolutely no ill effects whatsoever. They'll kill something and stash their carcass under a pile of dirt and leaves, and it'll rot away, and they'll come back and they'll eat on it until it's gone. They don't have a problem with it. And there have been some unfortunate instances during times of war where carnivores have come along and dug up the decaying corpses of servicemen and civilians and actually dined on them for food. Because to them, a rotting carcass is just food. So the reason that we first skin, pluck, bleed, and then cut and shape animal flesh into these rounded, smooth-edged, hand-sized objects is so that it will mimic edible plant parts and thereby circumvent our disgust response. That's why we can't eat it in its native form. That's why we have to change it, because in its native, unaltered form, we are disgusted by it, and we're trying to make it mimic these edible plant parts. So why is it that asymmetry, roundness, and smoothness is so important and attractive to us? It's because asymmetry in plant tissues is generally a sign or signal of disease and equates with poor nutritive value. When plants are well watered and receive adequate sunlight, nitrogen, and minerals. Their tissues, fruits, and seed pods are generally symmetrical and well-formed, and this symmetry, or beauty, if you will, signals that these items are likely packed with nutrients, are health-promoting, and therefore are the most desirable. When, on the other hand, plants are stressed by drought, nutrient-poor soil, inadequate sunlight, or become infected with insect or fungal parasites, their tissues and products become shrunken, shriveled, misshapen, and discolored. And these are signs that these tissues are very likely nutrient deficient. By contrast, true predators actually desire and actively look for asymmetry in their prey because these animals are likely to be lame, stupid, or defective in some way and therefore easier to catch. So if you're a predator and you're out on the savannah looking for something to eat and you see a three-legged antelope and you see a big, robust antelope with antlers, which one are you going to chase? The one with 3 legs. Because that one can't run as fast, he's not going to be able to fight as well, and he's going to be an easier meal for you to grab. So you actually want that defective looking food. You don't want the big, healthy, robust looking food. Well, why is this important? This brings up something I call the beauty paradigm and species destruction. Species survival in nature is fundamentally a question of energy out versus energy in, meaning if animals expend more energy procuring their food than they can extract from the food that they obtain, they will obviously starve to death and cease to exist as a species. For this reason, all true predator species seek, in essence, ugly food. That is, they desire food that requires a minimum expenditure of energy to obtain. This means they will not and do not waste time and energy pursuing the strongest and healthiest members of their prey species. Instead, they pursue the sick, the old, the lame, the stupid, or the very young, and they look for food that is already dead. Behaving in this manner ensures that they will ultimately strengthen the gene pool of the species that they prey on by weeding out the less fit. Is that clear to everybody? Because that's very, very important. But you contrast that with herbivores who actually seek the healthiest, most robust plants. They actually want the great migrations that take place in Africa and on the American savanna take place because these animals are actually moving from place to place looking for fresher, more verdant foliage, more healthier, more nutritious, more beautiful plants. Why? Because it is the most nutritious. When we as humans, because of our herbivore mindset, cull the most beautiful and robust members of the species that we choose to prey on, we are in effect weakening the gene pool of these species, and that is why we tend to drive so many species towards extinction, because we destroy them, and if we are using what is essentially the mindset of a plant eater, but we're using it to prey on animals. So that we're not looking for the weak and the defective. We want the big, strong, and beautiful, but that's the exact opposite of what nature intended. Is that point clear to everyone? That is one of the reasons predation by human beings is so environmentally destructive. Because we take out those best genes instead of leaving them in the gene pool. And eating and spreading the seeds of the healthiest plants actually ensure that they will become more plentiful. So that's why and when it comes to plant foods, it's a good thing. Yes?
So basically, if you're going to put it in the point, you're draining water from the gene pool instead of putting chlorine in it.
I'm sorry?
Instead of putting chlorine in the gene pool, you're draining water from it.
You can say it. All right, let's look at moist, wet, and squishy. So the reason we season and cook flesh is because these manipulations dry it out, give it the firm texture and taste of plant foods. Cooking is clearly and entirely unnatural behavior. And this means that the only way that we can tolerate flesh is by consuming it in an unnatural fashion.
Like chicken nuggets.
Yes. And again, this is because humans have the palate and preferences of an herbivore. We naturally love and crave the taste, textures, and colors and varieties of plant foods. Why do we love to grill, smoke, and barbecue? Well, it's because wood smoke is actually a flavoring that is created when intense heat breaks down plant tissues into some of the same aromatics that are found in true spices. This is a quote from a book called On Food and Cooking by an author named McGee. Now, some people said, no. The reason humans started cooking flesh was to sterilize it. Really? Really? Every Thanksgiving, like next week, somebody's going to get sick from eating poorly cooked turkey that they put in a $1,000 stainless steel range inside of a modern kitchen, and they couldn't sterilize it. You mean to tell me you actually think somebody sticking something into a fire out in the middle of a savannah is going to, sterilize that piece of animal tissue? That's ridiculous. That cooking did not evolve as a way of sterilizing flesh because roasting doesn't sterilize meat. The purpose and origin of cooking flesh was not hygienic. It was to impart the taste, texture of plant to animal flesh. And that's because the spices and herbs that we use to flavor meat and fish are all plant or plant parts or derived from plants. So in effect, we're trying to make the meat and fish taste like plants. Did you ever think about that? When's the last time your dog said, I'm not touching this piece of chicken until you put a peppercorn garnish on it and, and sear it with, some basil and garlic?
Mint jelly.
Yeah, okay.
Mint
Right.
jelly on lamb.
Exactly. The spice trade has been of major economic importance throughout human history and, as we know, helped spur the age of exploration. It turns out that only herbivores have a taste for and seek out salt. Even when dying from sodium depletion, carnivores will not seek or even eat salt. How do I know that? Because back in the 1950s, some very unfortunate studies were done where they artificially depleted dog chow of sodium, and they took these dogs and they would put out a bowl of this sodium depleted dog food, and right next to it they put a bowl of salt. Every day the dogs would come out, eat their food, never touch the salt, and they eventually died from sodium depletion. And they realized that these carnivores have no mechanism, internal mechanism, to tell them to eat salt. Well, obviously, if they're alive in nature, they wouldn't need it because animal tissues are loaded with salt. See, plant tissues, the primary cation is potassium. Sodium tends to be very low in plant tissues. So if you're an herbivore, you have to have some mechanism that tells you to actively go out and seek salt. If you're a carnivore, you don't need that because if you're eating flesh, you're getting tons of salt. So, and that's why deer, cows, all herbivores, humans love the taste of salt and potato chips. And searching for salt has been a major pursuit of every human society. Throughout history, salt has been an important and prized commodity. Cities were often founded in places with natural salt formations. The words salary and soldier were actually from words that originally meant salt, because years ago, that's how soldiers were paid, with salt. So, our manipulations of animal flesh are all designed to circumvent our disgust reflex. We try to make meat taste and smell like plants by cooking, seasoning, and marinating it in herbs, spices, and other plant products. We give it the texture of plants by bleeding, drying, cooking, and breading and frying it. We then try to make it look like plants by skinning, plucking, cutting, and shaping it and covering it with these brightly colored sauces and garnishes. Tests have repeatedly shown that people like a crispy and crunchy mouthfeel, but clearly these are not the textures of raw animal flesh. So this says a ghastly proposition. What would that be? Well, if you can read backwards, it says do it yourself. He's handing the guy a saw. You want to butcher this animal, you do it yourself. And that would be a ghastly proposition. In summary, humans do not like animal flesh in its unaltered native form. So, why did we seek to circumvent our disgust response? Why did we do that? I would ask, are we just stupid? But might get an answer to that. In order to circumvent our disgust reflex, we find it necessary, as we've just seen, to modify flesh by skinning, plucking, cutting, shaping, cooking, and flavoring it to mimic the look, taste, texture, and size of edible plants and plant parts. Humans found it necessary to do this to overcome our innate aversion and disgust response to animal flesh so that we could use animals for the calories that weren't available from plants in temperate areas during winter months. So as we migrated out of equatorial regions to more temperate areas, we started to use animals to obtain the calories that weren't available during winter months, but we had to do something to that animal tissue to make it acceptable, and that's how we came up with these ways of manipulating it. But why did we develop a disgust response to animal flesh in the first place? Well, because for an herbivorous species in a primitive environment, eating flesh carries a significant risk of death from choking or gastrointestinal infection. In equatorial regions, plant foods are abundant year-round, and attempting to hunt is therefore energetically wasteful because the energy content of plant foods and wild game are nearly equal, such that expending energy hunting does not improve survival. Again, how do I know that? Am I just making that up? Did I just come up with that off the top of my head, or God forbid, from some other place? No. Actually, a researcher by the name of Dr. Boyd Beaton from Emory University went to Africa, and he did a study where he looked at commonly eaten plant foods by Stone Age societies there versus commonly eaten game animals. And what he found was that the game animals had an energy content of 1.41 calories per gram, but the wild plant foods had an energy content of 1.29 calories per gram. Well, who remembers how to round up and round down in arithmetic? You got 1.4 versus 1.3. That's no statistical difference. But when you factor in the fact that animals have to be chased, they have to be wrestled with, they have to be hunted, and that most hunting forays aren't successful, you realize that you're going to expend a lot more energy, one, chasing animals that you never catch, and if you do catch up with them, you're going to run the risk of injuring yourself trying to kill them, for food that is not going to give you any kind of caloric advantage, because you can get the same number of calories from food that's just laying in the ground waiting to be picked and is not going to fight you or bite you or stab you with horns. So in that setting, hunting does not improve survival. In addition, hunting, as I stated, carries serious risk of injury or premature death, then that would obviously significantly reduce your chances of propagating your genes. But wild plants are in fact more nutritious because they not only have the calories, but they also have a higher content of vitamins, antioxidants, phytochemicals, and fiber, and they lack the pathogenic bacteria and viruses that are often found in animal tissues. Lastly, a distaste for violence and killing is a necessary prerequisite for a social species whose survival was dependent upon cooperation, interdependence, and the sharing of food resources, which have always been hallmarks of human societies. Killing is so antithetical to our innate nature that in every human society, all killing, whether it be an animal or human, must be considered justifiable. Killing for the sake of killing is universally viewed as reprehensible. And we all know that whenever a new serial killer pops up, one of the first things they say is, yeah, that boy used to go out into the woods and kill little farms, little animals. You know, I mean, because we recognize that propensity to kill without justification as being evidence of a serious character defect. Yes, ma'am.
This is important. As of this summer, the Veterans Administration has recognized that separate from post-traumatic stress disorder, there is another injury that all veterans have sustained, and that is a moral injury that they were required to kill as a condition of employment. This is such a
Wow.
breakthrough.
Oh,
It's called a
I'd like to.
moral injury.
Moral injury. Well, I'm gonna have to look for that because that's obviously right up, you know, exactly what I'm talking about. And again, this is in contrast to the true carnivores, which kill without reservation or remorse. Out of this inherited aversion to bloodletting and violence grows our sense of morality and ethics, which causes us to create laws and judicial systems. It also leads us to reject and ostracize selfish, violent-prone individuals, and to promote the greater good through philanthropy, such as these individuals working with Habitat for Humanity, cooperation, such as these individuals working on an agricultural farm, and through cooperation, caring, and sharing, such as these individuals helping each other and us, the less fortunate, at a soup kitchen. So, now we're going to look at learning to embrace our natural diet.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Because it relates to what we were just
Oh,
talking
sure.
about. People in the tropics, though, weren't all vegetarian, though, correct? I mean, they were, and even, of course, today now with modern guns and weapons,
Sure.
it's easier to kill. But how about in a, earlier stage?
Yeah, the question is that people living in the tropics weren't all vegetarians. And yes, it's true that tribal groups living in tropical areas aren't all typically vegetarian. One, they tend to eat a lot less animal food than we do. And in your typical Stone Age society, 80% of the calories that are consumed are plant calories in origin. But also, from an anthropological standpoint, many people believe that this hunting technology actually developed from humans migrating out of equatorial regions into temperate areas, developing the hunting technology, and then bringing it back into the equatorial areas, so that it didn't necessarily evolve there to begin with.
And then, of course, when we advanced our weaponry, it's made it
Right.
easier to get out there.
Yeah, and it's like nowadays, in modern days, all bets are off, because once something becomes a cultural value, it acquires value of its own. And unfortunately, people often ask me, they say, well, if when I do my talk, our human society eat meat, and I point out that in fact our bodies are not designed to eat meat, that animal flesh is actually very unhealthy for us. Well, I say, well, why is it that human beings like to eat meat? And I ask them, well, why is it that women like to go out and spend $40,000 on a dress they're going to wear once? It doesn't restore the hymen. It doesn't convince her friends she didn't have 5 boyfriends. But it is because it's a cultural value. We've attached cultural values to these things. And in essence, anything that is in short supply or that's hard to get, we tend to value more. And again, classically, throughout history, animal foods were more difficult to come by, and therefore people tended to prize what they couldn't have or what was more difficult to achieve. Yes, sir.
Is there a more modern or more recent understanding of groups like the Maasai, who in the past have been portrayed as being all animal-based diet groups?
The question is there a more recent study of the Maasai and their dietary practices? I don't know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that the Maasai tend to live in marginal, arid lands that are less hospitable to to raise to agriculture and raising plants, and as a result, they've developed a culture that uses animals to convert plants that they can't eat into calories that they can't consume. So again, that's a survival mechanism, but it's one that clearly, from a physiological standpoint, our body that doesn't really suit our bodies.
So if you had a population that was living in a garden and totally vegetarian, and then they moved north and into these freezing areas, shouldn't there have been some kind of genetic switch so that they're really almost a different species? In the sense that they're not, I mean, if you're in the Arctic and you're living on blubber, why didn't we get a genetic species switch?
All right, so the question is, if you have a species such as humans that are herbivorous, adapted to eating plants, they move to an area where they are, in effect, forced to eat animal foods for survival purposes, why didn't they change in some way to quote-unquote adapt to that diet? It's because human beings have this marvelous thing called technology. You see, animal species that weren't smart enough to come up with hunting technology actually did change. They actually became, for instance, bears. You look at brown bears. Brown bears are largely vegetarian, but when they moved to polar regions, they became polar bears, which changed to be the largest carnivores on Earth, and their teeth structure changed, their claws changed, their body habits changed to make them more efficient hunters. We didn't have to do that because instead of our bodies changing, our brains invented the technology that allowed us to adapt to it. And so it's the kind of rather glib analogy I use is that you can put a pig on a plane and make it go through the air at 500 miles an hour, but that doesn't mean it was meant to fly. And it's because we now have technology that allows us to do what our bodies want. And because we were smart enough to invent technology to overcome our physical limitations, our bodies did not have to adapt. And that's what prevented us from having to adapt. Now, we did pay a cost in that when you actually look at the studies that were done on Inuit peoples before they adopted very Western lifestyles, they had very short lifespans. Average life expectancy was like 45 years, and they were dead because their teeth would wear out, they would have strokes, and all sorts of other problems from eating this completely animal-based diet. It had a very deleterious effect on their health. But the reason they were able to do it was because of the technology they invented that allowed them to do what their bodies didn't. Ted, did you have some?
Well, just a couple points about that. One is, I agree with you about the Inuit. The other thing is the Maasai also have a very short lifespan, and they also tend to eat more vegetation than we think that they do. But there is actually some adaptation that has taken place. For example, what about lactose tolerance?
Yes.
I mean, Northern Europeans and even the Maasai are not lactose intolerant. I mean,
They're lactose persisters.
75% of adults on the planet are lactose intolerant. I mean, they can't consume dairy without getting sick. But there are certain populations that have lost that gene and since have mutated so they can tolerate dairy. So that actually is a challenge.
Yeah. So there has been some mild adaptation in selecting for people who actually continue to make the enzyme lactase as they after they become adults, so they can eat dairy foods. You find this in dairy cultures, but there's really been no adaptation to flesh consumption, and that's because we have knives and spears and all these other things to do with what our bodies want. All right, so while learning to get around our innate aversion to eating animal flesh may have conferred survival advantages in the past as we migrated out of equatorial regions to temperate areas where plant foods weren't abundant year-round, this is clearly no longer the case. We now have Whole Foods and Safeway and agriculture that provide us with a stunning array of different plant foods, and we now know that plant foods are abundant and readily available throughout the calendar year. And as it turns out, Science has shown us that a plant-based diet is the healthiest diet we can consume once we are weaned, and this diet is also the best diet for our planet. And this begs the question, how green is your diet? Animal-based agriculture is one of the major contributors to massive increases in greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, which are responsible for causing global warming and climate change. After energy production, raising animals for consumption is the number one cause of global warming and is responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that is more than the greenhouse gases that are produced by all of the cars, trucks, trains, and planes combined. And down here at the bottom it says cattle emit huge amounts of methane that have a warming effect 23 times greater than carbon dioxide, and they also emit large amounts of nitrous oxide, which actually has a warming effect over 296 times as potent as carbon dioxide, which is why I've labeled this a really, really inconvenient truth. And I was so annoyed when Al Gore got that Nobel Prize because he knew this information and chose to ignore it. And I would just like to take that Nobel Prize and, well,
Never mind, go on.
I'll just leave that to your imagination.
What about my increase in gas output since I became a vegan?
How long have you been vegan?
About 6 months.
That will slowly go away as your colonic flora adapt. The gas production will decrease.
That's good to know.
You will adapt to a less gas producing flora. Just hang in there, and your wife, hang in there. At over 7 billion individuals, humans display the classic population dynamics of a typical social herbivore species. Switching to a vegetarian or vegan diet will reduce your carbon footprint by more than 1.5 tons of carbon per year. That's more than if you change to a hybrid car. And so my statement is that if you drive a Prius and use compact fluorescent bulbs and still eat meat, you need a lot more fiber in your diet. If you get my drift, because you're full of it. Books such as Beyond Beef, The Empty Ocean, and Water Follies document the destructive impact our animal food addiction has on our planet. In Beyond Beef, Jeremy Rifkin highlights the true cost of and the problems associated with beef production, including the famine, waste, and environmental destruction resulting from overgrazing cattle and raising rainforests to raise beef for export. Since the 1970s, over 25% of Central American rainforests have been cleared for cattle pasture. He also documents the toxic effects of billions of tons of animal waste. Over 11,000 tons are produced per second in this country. The misuse of water resources, over 50% of the annual water use in the United States is for raising livestock. And the massive amounts of fossil fuels used as both fuel and petroleum-based fertilizer and as fuel for the farm equipment that are used to grow grain that we then turn around and feed to farm animals. And it says fossil fuel-based farming contributes to global warming by using non-renewable and poorly recycled forms of carbon. While Rifkin's book only deals with beef, the issues that he raised are also germane to poultry and pork production as well. We know that runoff from hog farms have caused massive fish kills due to Listeria bacteria, and we know that the H1N1, aka swine flu, originated on a giant hog farm down in Mexico. In Water Follies, Robert Glennon explores the negative impact or overuse of groundwater for irrigation and agribusiness has on the environment, including ground salinization, and how this widespread use portends a crisis of widespread water scarcity. Researchers also predict that as global water warming progresses, sea levels will rise, widespread drought will increase, and this may potentially incite wars and other international conflicts over the declining sources of fresh water and arable land. The Empty Ocean documents how human predation has caused the collapse of major fish stocks and threatens others. Many species have declined by more than 90%. Author Richard Ellis argues that human activities are driving many marine species towards extinction. Many animals are killed as unwanted bycatch, such as this sea turtle. And we are destroying the architecture of the ocean by scouring reefs through reckless, indiscriminate bottom trawling. This is a reef before bottom trawling for shrimp. And this is what it looks like after they drag that big sledge through there just so that they can get the shrimp. This is horrible what we're doing to the oceans. And the 2006 census study predicts that all commercially fished species will collapse by 2050 if our current fishing trends continue.
What does the government do about it? They talk about coal and gas and.
The question is, what is the government doing about this? Not a lot, because the people in the government like to eat meat, which is why this movement has got to go from the grassroots up. And then lastly, I just want to touch on overt versus covert environmental damage, because these preceding instances of how our animal-based diets negatively affect the environment were examples of overt human impact. There are other less direct but equally harmful covert instances of the negative impact our dietary choices have on our environment. An example is the human-driven depletion of wild salmon populations. Salmon are the currency of biological richness. This is a quote from a PBS special on salmon, and it details how alpine rivers and streams are generally clear and clean, and as a consequence, very nutrient poor. The annual and often year-long migration of various species of salmon upstream up to their birth, rivers and tributaries, actually represents a massive and necessary transfer of nutrients from the ocean back to these alpine river watershed ecosystems. Salmon deliver nutrients directly to rivers and streams when they die and decay after spawning, and they also enrich the entire ecosystem by becoming food for the animals and insects in that ecosystem and fertilizing the plant life through the droppings that are deposited by the organisms that are fed on them, as well as by the bodies of the animals after they themselves die. Now, while the primary cause of the decline in Pacific Northwest salmon populations has been habitat destruction and the damming of river systems, the unnecessary added pressure of commercial fishing, which takes out over 100,000 tons of salmon every year, constitutes a potentially unsustainable, deleterious, discretionary burden of clearly questionable validity. By contributing to the depletion of Pacific salmon runs, we're damaging entire ecosystems in unknown ways because we are removing a major source of vital nutrients. Given that these ecosystems developed over millennia dependent upon the annual infusion of these marine nutrients and organic materials into the environment by the returning Pacific salmon populations, it is a safe inference that this massive and long-term removal of these nutrients cannot help but have a baleful and far-reaching effect on both the fauna and flora of these regions. When we catch and consume huge amounts of Pacific salmon, we are in effect intercepting nutrients nature had targeted to northwestern ecosystems and tying them up in our bodies instead. We then eventually lock these nutrients away in the sediment of sewage treatment plants, the detritus of landfills and septic tanks, and in cemeteries that are far removed from their intended destinations. What the ultimate impact and effect of this wholesale transfer of nutrients out of these ecosystems will be is unclear, and may not be known for generations. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. At some point in our future, assuming there is one, when magnificent species like bluefin tuna and swordfish no longer exist, children will ask what became of these ancient, ineffable, and irreplaceable creatures, and what on earth are we going to tell them? What are we going to say? That we destroyed them for something as ephemeral, crass, and unimportant as the way they tasted? If we do, that will be a truly sad and tragic legacy. this last couple slides, there is a way out of this, and that is to simply listen to our inner selves and return to the diet that we were meant to eat. So, in closing, I just want to leave you with these thoughts. Our ability as humans to reprogram ourselves is both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. The plasticity and adaptability of human cultures have allowed us to colonize and exploit every corner of the globe, but they've also caused us to become the most rapacious, cruel, and environmentally destructive organism the world has ever known. We're moving beyond our natural diet. Once conferred survival advantages on peripatetic adventurers, it now wreaks havoc on our health and on the earth and its ecology. We have been spectacularly successful as a species, but that very success makes it more important than ever that we learn to live within our true ecological niche as herbivores. We must do this not only for our own health and collective well-being, but for the benefit of the planet and its other inhabitants as well. And I will leave you with the words, prophecy from the book of Isaiah. It says, the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together. The cow and the bear shall graze, and their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord. This is from Isaiah chapter 11. Let's hasten that day by all choosing to become vegan. Thank you for your time.